record on this. Ta-da! We are in business. Okay. We will now, well, welcome everybody. There's been some time for everybody to join, so welcome to our November 2021 jobs report and year-end recap. We hope you are safe wherever you may be. Today, we're going to recap the November 2021 jobs report, which just came out early this morning, which showed an increase of 210,000 jobs. We'll also be recapping how 2021 went, even though there's 1 month left to go, and give you an update on inflation numbers, especially with the upcoming holiday season. With us, Dr. Reilly White, an associate professor of finance and endowed Bank of America lecturer at University of New Mexico. In addition to teaching MBA students, Dr. White serves as the University Outreach Chair for the CFA Society of New Mexico, Chair of the Cassidy CFA Scholarship, and advisor for the 3.6 million student-run UNM Regions portfolio. Prior to his career in academia, Dr. White worked as an analyst for a large Boston-based bank, where he learned a great deal about company analysis, funding, and maintaining ethical corporate leadership. As a note, this will be recorded and made available within 7 business days. While this will be him presenting to us, please feel free to ask questions in the chat and I will direct his attention to them if you do have questions. Over to you, Dr. White.
Oh, thank you so much, Colin. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Albert's list and all those attendees today. So grateful that you were able to make it out on this Friday evening, uncomfortably close to dinner time, but hopefully you are in the comfort of your own homes or finishing up your work days, wherever they might be. So I'm super grateful to be here today. We had a very interesting jobs report today. It's interesting because there are good things and bad things about this. And so I've prepared a little presentation as part of today's spiel where I will go over the magic and wonders that is the job report of November. And so here's what we got. So we looked at this thing this morning and I'm like, okay, consensus estimates was close to 500,000 jobs. That would be nice. However, it was bad. And I looked in the data and then it was not so bad for a couple of reasons we'll get into. It is a weird and complex and interesting jobs report. Actually, it's one of those interesting ones we've seen so far. So I've decided to look at it in a different way than we've done in previous months. Why was it so interesting? You might ask. So in one sense, it's like half of this is blah, half of this is interesting, half of this is fun. So on one hand, we added about 210,000 new jobs. That was about what we added. That would be considered a pretty okay number if this wasn't an economic recovery period. And actually, it's not a bad number ipso facto. It is not where we want to be because we're trying to accelerate the economic growth. But that was a little disappointing. However, unemployment fell to 4.2%. That is a tremendous drop. That's a 0.4% drop in the course of a month. And let's dive into what that means. So we talked in previous sessions about the importance of labor force participation, the number of people who are 16 and over and also looking for work. The unemployment number that we talk about is what we call U3, and that's a very specific measure of unemployment. And participation levels, unfortunately, we were hoping for, I was talking months ago about the hope that in fall, participation levels would increase because, kids would be back in school, working parents could feel more comfortable about going out of the home to find jobs, and it remains stable. The good news is we actually saw it's been flat. It's been, it's been just an empty, vast surface of nothingness for months now. And now we see a little blip upwards on participation. It went from about 61.6% to 61.8%. That 0.2% is gold because of what it means. The labor force grew by nearly 600,000 workers. 600,000 more workers said they were part of the labor force than before. That's a huge growth in a very short amount of time. More importantly, more than 1.1 million workers compared to the previous month reported they were working from before. So the question is why did we add 210,000 jobs? And why isn't this the same number? Why do these not equate? Where the labor force grew by 600,000 workers, we added 210,000 new jobs. Why is this different? And the interesting part is it comes from where we get the numbers from. There are 2 surveys that give us these numbers. And these surveys, one of these surveys, the survey that reports the number of new jobs, goes out to employers. When we think about labor force participation rates, when we think about unemployment rates, that goes out to householders. So householders, people who hold houses amongst their heads, but households. So one is employers, one is households. Normally they agree, and I'll explain to you what this means in a little bit. Normally they agree and they're very consistent. However, in this particular one, and why it was a little baffling, is that they show disagreement. So we have kind of this jobs report from employers. Households are saying we're back working and more people are working than ever before. Now, which of these do you trust? Now, so typically over the long term, the numbers agree. Over the short term, they often do not, especially in recession periods. I think we had a big deviation following the 2008 financial crisis. And economists often like, in general, this employer survey a little bit better because it has a larger sample size. So the problem with households is it's very selective. We end up with certain data characteristics about the number of people who say elect to fill out a survey. It is limited in its demographic potential and reach, and often very limited in its perspective. Whereas in the employer survey, employers tend to, this tends to be a bit larger and more predictable. So one possible scenario from this is, and this is, this isn't utterly proven, this is one reaction to this. The household survey data overstates potentially the jump in the labor force, but maybe the labor force wasn't actually as stagnant as we thought it was over the last few months because of the unreliability of data. What was special about November? And the answer is not a great deal. It's not like we had good news in October on the jobs report. My thought is probably a little bit of a combination of that. There's more month-to-month variation, but in the long run, it does even out. So how do you interpret this jobs report? And also, by the way, I want anyone to feel free to ask questions in the chat window and other places. I will get them. Don't be worried, no such thing as a foolish question, no these other things. And I just want you to feel confident and comfortable about asking any type of question at all and what your reactions might be. So one reaction to this is maybe we have to trust the levels, but not the individual month-to-month changes. Maybe not the rates, trust the levels, not the rates. Not the changes, maybe is a better way to call this. It's a fly by night. I was doing this between the meetings today. I had meetings starting at 7 a.m. and I was like, oh, I gotta do this. This is so interesting. And then I was hoping, so I kind of I was hoping it would be a good jobs report, but it's an interesting one. It ended up being a little bit more challenging. So if we look at these three measures of what means of sort of our employment growth, household surveys, the payroll survey, and the adjusted household survey, they do follow one another. There is kind of a consistency throughout this. One is not completely off base with another, and these are all within the bounds of what are reasonable statistical deviations. The hard part is when this goes down like this, and you get this number, and I want you to point to this sort of the household surveys in green and the adjusted household survey in blue, we end up in this level where like suddenly it was flat for a long time, and then whoa, suddenly it goes up quite a bit. And these are in aggregate. So right now it looks like we had a huge recovery in November. It's quite possible that the line was somewhere in the middle of these three lines, in that the data is showing us sort of different parts of that at different perspectives, and that seems likely. But that said, again, the bottom line is maybe participation is actually coming back in a meaningful way. And maybe that October and September numbers were aberrations. But the hard part is anything we can extract from this is limited because we need more data points. And unless you are a finance faculty like me, it's hard to write a paper out of one single data point. So let's look at the sector breakdown here. And so one of the things that we want to look at, where did the jobs come from and where did they go? So most sectors got or won jobs, some sectors lost jobs. When we think about these things, number one, and this is very encouraging for our Albert's List folks out there today, professional and business services, again, in that sense, the white collar worker side of the world, looking at these sort of things and looking at this and saying, well, this goes from everything from business services that handle everything from marketing to advertising to revenue sources to accounting, all those other things. They increased by 90,000 jobs. And this shows that companies are planning for the future. Often these roles are heavily based on planning expectations of growth and are symptomatic of a strong and relatively robust recovery. We've also seen increases. Number two, transportation and warehousing. We talked about this last month, how we have this continued sort of crisis with regards to the our supply chains. And transportation is they're actively and aggressively recruiting. And this is a good sign that the sector is on its way to fill some of the jobs that they're lacking that are causing some of the frictions within our supply chain. So again, makes sense, and that's good. Manufacturing growth is particularly interesting, and I'm going to note this later because our manufacturing growth is interesting because it's also in the context of, when you think of the United States, we are a net importer versus a net exporter. We import a lot more than we export, and but it doesn't mean that we should, neglect our manufacturers, which are still a very, very important part of the economy and the economy in the Bay Area, but manufacturing employment jumped, and that's very promising because at the same time, the dollar became more valuable, and the dollar has been going up in value. The dollar actually is very close to its high over the last year as well as over the last couple years. And we'll get into why the dollar is so expensive right now relative to other things. But the dollar is strong, and that makes U.S. goods less competitive overseas. Yet the economy is so robust domestically that we're seeing increases in our manufacturing spending, and that's very interesting. And then construction, leisure, and hospitality. Those leisure and hospitality numbers are not where we want them to be for something in that sector, and I'll show you why. Year-on-year rates of wage growth in leisure and hospitality, a 14% average wage growth across this sector in the last year, 14%, which dwarfs the national estimates, and that's very, very interesting. So financial activities, wholesale trade, those are a little bit up. On the other side of these things, and this is the other side of disappointment mountain, is we got retail trade coming down, and this is a very interesting point. Retail trade, of course, is symptomatic of our holiday season expenditures, which in November we usually see increases of. We're seeing less retail trade this month. Government spending, and that's been lagging for some time. Governments are finding a very difficult time to hire workers, and there's a few reasons behind that. And for instance, here in New Mexico, where I'm a professor at New Mexico, one of the things that we do, we have a large city that has 25% of its workforce is funded, but does not have people within it. Municipalities have, unlike private companies, municipalities can't adjust wages in response to demand very quickly. And so sometimes you end up in a situation where, like if I'm operating my own business and I can't get employees, I'll be like, I'll try it. I'll find someone at $16 an hour or $18 an hour, and I'll find some rate very quickly at which I can meet that. So the problem is in governments and these things, they're tiered. There are often limits on the way they can raise wages. And in that perspective, this is often an annual unionized decision. So consequently, we're seeing people leave government jobs, which might otherwise be perceived as stable and interesting, and go into private sector for superior wages. And that's particularly true among lower wage jobs. And that becomes very, very difficult. So I think we're going to see continued difficulty with government being able to compete meaningfully. And this is a national problem, and not just California and everywhere else, but it's a very national problem involving being able to get and keep reliable government work. And so it's very, very interesting. All right. So any questions about this so far, by the way? How are we doing?
Yeah, I have a question. The dollar became more valuable. Is that compared to other foreign currencies?
Yes. What does it mean? Great question, Colin. Don't let me leave that hanging. Reilly, you gave me a relativistic measure of the dollar against what? Against an index or basket of representative currencies sorted or weighted by their economic growth. And I'll show you what that looks like. Actually, we can skip down to it now because that's a great question. We have here, this is sort of the US dollar currency index. Also, you can follow it as DXY. It's really, really hard to look at, we see the dollar euro relationship, the dollar yuan, the dollar, peso, and we end up in these different, realms. And often those deal with different trade situations or perspectives from two different economies as they relate to one another. The dollar index puts them all together and says, how's the dollar doing? This index goes back, and it's tough to see if you have a very tiny screen or you're in the cheap seats, 1980. And this is 2021. And what we've seen actually, and this is very interesting, after going down in the recession, it has gone up. And this little, I know I put this blip, so this is an impossible to read chart because if it's an irrational thing, my bad, but that's why, that's why I'm not an academic. So in this far right hand, and this is like March 2020 in the beginning of the pandemic, it's been going up fairly steadily. And we're at a level now where we've kind of reached at certain points in 2015, 2016, and 2020. And there's a lot of forces at play that suggest we should be the dollar should be in the long run declining in value, but at the same time, the dollar strength is relative to the rest of the world and the rest of the currency baskets. So the United States pushing a lot of money into this place, still perceived as a haven for investment and other things, is still driving the value of the dollar up and the demand for our currency upwards, which is a very, very interesting dynamic. So that's a very good question, Colin. So it is against everything, or at least the major currencies that which we maintain trading relationships.
So now is technically the best time to travel.
That's right. It is getting easier, isn't that? Isn't that delightfully ironic?
The time when
Hello,
we
may I
can't
enter your
travel is the
country?
best time to spend the US dollar.
It is the best time to spend the US dollar. Travel overseas, it is a good thing. It is actually a good thing. It makes our manufacturers' exports less competitive. But yes, to Colin, when you guys have the Albert's List international vacation, you guys will have a great a great spending power in most countries. Not all of them, but some of them have been increasing steadily. That's a great question. So one of the things, I'm going to zoom into each of these charts individually because they're really hard to read, but I'll start with this one first. And so one of the things that we look at when we think about the way that we think of the change in employment, and what's really interesting between February and November, one of the things that's fascinating for policymakers is how do we get more people back into the workforce that were lost from the workforce? And exactly, how do we look at these numbers and what makes sense? So if we look at it this way and we sort it by white men, white women, black men, black women, Hispanic men, Hispanic women, and Asian, the percentage point change in employment population ratio between February and November varies quite a bit. And particularly among this, between white women and black women and Hispanic women, they were hit the worst in a lot of the pandemic. Of course, we look at childcare and elder care as a source of this. One concern is, of course, is that people in multi-income households, the burden often falls disproportionately on women for those roles. And so consequently, many left the workforce and many had not recovered or not rejoin the workforce. And again, if you're not in the workforce, you're not actively looking for a job, then you're not counted as being unemployed. And so this becomes, it's almost like, where did these people go? And so when we think of policy, how do we get people involved? Why is this hitting? And it's hitting not only this, but also minority women, as well as people without college diplomas. And so one encouraging factor about this jobs report, this specific jobs report, and I'll switch from this chart to this chart, is if we look at the unemployment rate in a different way, maybe I'll do a little switcheroo here. And this is from the Economic Policy Institute. And so they looked at different workers and rates, and they have the same basic divisions here, of course. Unfortunately, white women, the Economic Policy Institute, of course, not tracking Asian men or Asian women, which is one job, Economic Policy Institute. But in these angles, what was interesting, if we look at the October to November numbers, the greatest improvements that we saw in unemployment rates occurred among the most adversely affected populations in the pandemic, the people who were out of the workforce. And that's very, very encouraging to suggest that people are now able to find jobs, and now including workers who are undereducated, including workers in minority roles, are in a position where the job market is actually serving in a positive light. And it's taken quite a long time. This was always tracking behind in these categories, particularly among Black men and Black women. And now these increases are really meaningful. These are meaningful increases on a month-to-month basis. And this is coming from the employer survey data. And this is a really interesting finding. It's a very, very interesting finding. And I'm going to go into more details about the overall unemployment rate and what that means in a second. But I wanted to promise you, before we get into anything more, let's talk a little bit more about the Bay Area, where we are and what's happening and what's going on. Two big things I want to point out from this. We've had, here's the good news here. Remember, the Bay Area, when we look at metropolitan area populations, data is delayed for this, so we won't get this data till much later this month. For November, in San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward, the October numbers came out fairly recently. In the October numbers, that was the month where we talked about last month. We had strong overall job growth, but participation rate remained the same. We ended up in the Bay Area, and maybe I can zoom in as well to kind of go over some of these things in a little bit more clarity. For instance, the civilian labor force in the Bay Area increased about 10,000. That's a good sign. My guess is in November, it'll show an even higher growth rate. And the hard part is that I was a bit concerned because it dropped. It looked like as of July, we had a robust growth rate, and then it fell a little bit in August and September. Total employment, meaning that, so labor force is everybody who's out there looking for jobs and those things. Total employment increased about 16,000 in a month. And that's capping two very, very strong months of growth in September and October. The unemployment, the number of people who are physically unemployed fell to 111,000. That's the lowest number we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic. And the unemployment rate consequently also dropped to 4.5%. That's this 111,000 divided by the labor force as specified by people who are physically out there looking for jobs. And so which sectors were hit best, which sectors were doing well? We always talk a lot about non-farm wages because non-farm wages, for the farmers in Albert's list, I'm not ignoring you, but this is primarily one of the economic data points that we follow, our non-farm data. And there's a few interesting notes for the Bay Area. And so the first is one, manufacturing. Employment has really struggled to build out manufacturing. The Bay Area, 140,000 manufacturing employees, huge export market, and it is adversely affected by increases in currency prices, ports that are having difficulty exporting and importing goods, and at the same time also our trade and tariff relationships with other countries. As you know, the last administration as well as this administration are relatively protectionist compared to other time periods, and the downside of that is that does limit the manufacturing outputs in certain places. Here, and it's interesting because it's too early. There's speculation about, well, if we think about this, we hear a lot of news about especially the tech companies as they look to sort of maintain and grow things like the silicon chip shortage, and sort of increase the number of chips that are being built and all these other things that require a lot of manufacturing plants. And so far we don't see that's going to be a many-month, multi-year phenomenon if it does occur in the Bay Area. So you won't see it in this data, but we do look for how this as opposed to how manufacturers are doing, and they're not doing as well as some other places. Albert has a question. Is everyone printing more money at this point? Everyone's money printer. Everyone's money printer. And this is really interesting. Albert asked a good question about monetary policy, particularly with global policy. The United States is particularly aggressive with its money printers. We have state-of-the-art money printers that are very fast. And other countries are occupying in different ways, like the Treasury came out today, and some thought they were going to issue, one of the things is that, so markets are interesting things, and people, every country to some extent, either explicitly or implicitly, including the United States, affects their currency's value in certain ways. And we saw currencies in countries that do it more blatantly, we call them currency manipulators. The Treasury didn't label any currency manipulators today. They thought, oh, they labeled China, and they didn't label Taiwan or Vietnam either. And I mean, that does make a sensible geopolitical move, as Taiwan and Vietnam are important geopolitical allies. But money printers are happening worldwide. Everyone is influencing their own markets individually. And anywhere where you see, I mean, we have a very unique, robust, and calculated way of bringing it back. We have the largest scale, but even, certain policies, even, I would argue that even in a limited extent, the European Central Bank, as well as other places, are operating in ways that are outside of their typical comfort zones with regards to printing money. And then when we think about trade transportation, this is interesting. Trade transportation added almost over 5,000 jobs in the Bay Area. And the Bay Area is pretty good like this, because one of the things that I like about following this now for over a year through Albert's list and looking at Bay Area employment specifically, is that often when we see changes in the Bay Area, they're repeated elsewhere in the country, like the following month. And so it's really interesting about this data. And I saw this and I'm like, oh, that's a very robust number for trade, transportation, and utilities. And then the national numbers came out and I'm like, oh, look at this. Everyone's adding trade in November. So in October, they added, the Bay Area added over 5,000 jobs in trade. So that means that even though we're not export facing, even though the manufacturing necessarily isn't coming back, trade, transportation, utilities are doing really well. Information, on the other hand, has been relatively flatlined since July. And we had some ups and downs here and there. And that's, it's nothing to be concerned about per se. Again, if we look year on year, it's still about 4.8% higher than it was 12 months ago. Professional business services, whoops, had similarly, and I thought this was really cool too. Professional business services, a 9,000 person jump. And we saw that robust number. And then what happened in the rest of the country in November? The big number of 90,000. So again, Bay Area still leads the way with respect to the way that it handles the economic recovery relative to some sectors of the economy. And likewise, if we go down a little bit here, and just for the shiznit, bucking the trend, and this is really interesting. We did have an additional 7,000 jobs in government. Disappointing a little bit in leisure and hospitality. They're still struggling to recover some lost employment in the trade and tourism area. In the Bay Area, still hovering. Only added about 2,000 jobs in October. Education added about 1,000 jobs, but overall, bucking national trends. Otherwise, government did well, professional and business services did well, and information did well. So it's really, it's what a time to be alive. Now, yes, Colin, questions, any questions? Yes.
What falls under other services, just so we can have an idea of what that growth is?
That's a really good question. So there are things that include services, but are specifically not public administration services. So this would be interested, like, let's say you're working for a nonprofit grant firm, or a grant firm. No, a nonprofit company working in grants, laundry services, repair and maintenance services fall here. Sometimes private households fall here. It's like sort of a weird thing. Hairdressers fall here. Some supervisors, other places. What am I missing? So there's a whole bunch of, I should have actually broken that. So other services is like an unclassifiable, unrelated pool. Oh yeah, automotive services as well. So they have, it's like you perform a service that doesn't fit neatly into information. It doesn't fit necessarily into professional and business services. You could make an argument and be like, well, automotive service could be, we can all like put, it's like that, a child's game where we're putting square things in round holes, and we're trying to figure out where to put it. So they put it in a pile called other. So other, also, I mean, a modest 600 job increase. I don't know.
And earlier, when you answered Albert's question on the money printer thing, and then you casually said governments have a way of bringing that money back in.
Yes.
Aside from taxation, what are their methods? What are their avenues for getting money out of the economy?
Oh, that's a good question. So in and out of the economy, governments maintain many different, that's a great question, Colin. So when you think about how governments operate with regard to influencing monetary behavior, so United States in particular, in sort of the Fed, in addition to a few things, so their policy initiatives, so the Fed, of course, as it exists in many nations, is an independent entity. Its head is appointed by Congress, but in the president, but by the president and voted in by Congress, as well as the individual. The United States is divided into 12 Federal Reserve districts. There's no District 13, but there are 12 districts. And each of these districts is based on kind of where the population of the United States lived in 1913, when the Federal Reserve started to exist. And so you have the entire West Coast is a district, San Francisco. And then you have Pennsylvania is divided into 2 districts because it's so powerful. You have these situations, a state of 13 million people, right? And so you have this situation where you have the Fed, and each of these representative agencies makes a decision based on the economy. When you think of monetary policy decisions from the Fed, the most obvious one that people think of is, of course, its ability to affect a single rate of interest, the discount rate, which is overnight lending to large banks. And so when the Fed meets, and the discussion is going to happen about whether they're going to raise rates next year, and I believe they will, they're going to, when we think about how the effects of this on the economy, as the Fed raises rates and lowers rates, they increase and decrease the monetary supply. If you increase rates, you do so to limit economic activity. That increases the discount rate. That makes less projects worthwhile to do. And consequently, you kind of put a cap on economic growth. That's why there's a hesitancy on this. But it also controls inflation. When you lower rates, you can stimulate the economy because there's a lot of cheap money floating around really quickly. What makes the United States Fed very interesting is we embarked upon a very ambitious balance sheet building phenomenon that really led the world in its ability to show, and it's a very bold, it was a very bold policy. We did it in a very limited sense following 2008. It was very aggressive in this role. And what they did was they intervened in the bond markets. And so they bought a lot of mortgage-backed securities, tons of mortgage-backed securities. One of the reasons we've seen such, or has been speculated, well, there's data to support this and also data to support that it's a complex series of factors. One of the reasons we've seen such a large increase in housing prices is of course supply and demand issues in the last year. And I know that housing prices is a relative measure. I know that we've seen some price decreases in like the city itself of San Francisco, but then when we consider the broader Bay Area, and you think of the East Bay all the way down to Silicon Valley, and you think of the increases in prices that we've seen, people moving out of internal cities to outer greener suburbs and other things during the pandemic. That was driven by supply and demand, but the Fed exacerbated this in some ways by buying a lot of mortgage-backed securities. This was to prevent economic failure and prevent markets from failing in times of uncertainty. They took on a huge amount of trillions and trillions of dollars on their balance sheet. And that's one way they can aggressively affect monetary policy, because by buying a lot of these securities, they keep liquidity flowing into the market. And what this does is it makes it prevents in many ways the failure of these markets. One thing that worked against us in 2008, 2009 was during the time that preceded the Great Recession, was that a lot of markets that we thought were fairly bulletproof ended up having liquidity issues, liquidity crises. We ended up seeing bank failures and sort of vast disturbances across the market, which exacerbated our economic recovery. Prevented our economic recovery, not exacerbated it, in a very timely fashion. And so they can intervene very directly. Also, countries often intervene heavily in trade policy. That becomes an important point. Trade policy becomes an initiative where countries can aggressively impart or subsidize what they import against, or subsidize their exports. For instance, United States, we've maintained a very relatively protective agricultural policy. That came to light, particularly in the 1990s, once we introduced NAFTA. When we think about these sort of basic economics, we look at an opportunity when we go back, to 200 years of economic theory. We look at different places will produce different goods more affordably, and depending on what they specialize in the best. And I think of David Ricardo speaking of England and Portugal, and we talked about, well, England can do textiles, but Portugal can produce wine, and so the Portuguese will produce all the wine, and England will produce all the textiles, and that's how the economy will sort themselves out. And other countries outside of the United States, for instance, could produce corn cheaper, but we subsidized corn, and we made our exports of corn underpriced local markets for corn. And anyone who understands sort of Mexican history in the 1990s understand what a huge economic effect that was, particularly in impoverished regions of Mexico that relied on corn for exports, and how prices were undercut, and that likely contributed to some of the political unrest in places like Chiapas and other things. So it's a really interesting connected story, but there's a lot of ways we affect the economy, the governments can do. I noticed was there a question as well?
Yeah.
I noticed there was, yeah.
Albert has asked, do you anticipate another 2008 event again, or are there protections in place?
Oh, here's the thing, everything echoes, but nothing really repeats. So that's the best part about this. We're all looking in our glasses and saying like, oh man, is this going to happen again? So the good news is not right now. We don't have any indicator for this. The yield curve isn't inverted. It's upwardly sloping. We have reasons to suspect economic growth will continue for a while. And all of that sounds good. All of that sounds good so far. In the long run, will we have another recession, economic crisis? Absolutely. Where it will come from, where it will go, I don't know. Oh, yes, cool. This is a good question. Is there a chance it comes out of nowhere? This is a good question. Is something ever, this is like a philosophical question, Albert. Does something ever come out of nowhere, or do we just not see it? Or is our head turned in the wrong direction when it does come? And the thing is we are hyper-focused on certain parts. Bank liquidity is really good. Like, for instance, we look at the real estate market, for instance. Right now, people are like, it's very expensive. It's more expensive than it was in 2006 and 2007 when the market was crazy. So maybe it's a little bit maybe it's overvalued. Maybe the real estate market is right for a crash. The downside is, if we look at the data behind those numbers, 2006, 2007, that was a real estate market that was kind of standing on these clay legs, because it had borrowers who were very, very not well capitalized, didn't have high credit scores. This market, banks are well capitalized, borrowers have high credit scores, and they're still getting these loans, and it's really cheap. So we don't see it in this same way, and that's the really interesting part. It will happen somewhere else, and this game is speculative. Your guess is probably as good as mine, and my guess is if you sent something early on, and as I say, if it happens in the Bay Area first, or it happens somewhere else, let us know. Be like, there's a run on something. If money is printed but no one can touch it, does it exist? That's right. The short answer is yes and maybe. So maybe, that's a technical term.
Earlier, you mentioned that the Feds have announced they're tapering on quantitative easing next year. I don't think you explained like how that will affect the economy. And based on my very rudimentary understanding, is that whenever the Fed tapers on quantitative easing, we see a recession.
Oh, no, that's a really good question. So, okay, that's a good question. All right, so quantitative easing as a thing is itself a policy that is derived from difficult economic scenarios. Like when 2008, 2009, we called that quantitative easing. We actually named them in the first word. We said quantitative easing. We had part 1 and part 2. And then when this recession happened last year in the pandemic, the Fed went, we're going to put all the tools to like every tool we have at our use at once. And this is what we're going to do. Quantitative easing is not normal in good times to have. Right now we have, and this is the sort of interesting aspects of this economy. We lost 17 million jobs in March, April of last year in 2020. That was the largest single number of jobs we've lost since we had record keeping began. I mean, in aggregate, the Great Depression was worse, but it was a huge number of jobs. We also gained it back much faster. And that's one of the reasons here, and you can kind of visualize it actually literally in this chart too. And one aspect about this, Scott, yeah, Scott's absolutely right, default currency, there you go. And one aspect about quantitative easing is it's done in such a way to encourage the liquidity of markets. Quantitative easing includes the aspect that we have low rates, or we're keeping rates low, making it incentivizing people not to save money, but to spend money. And when we think about releasing quantitative easing, we shouldn't always possess it within an economy. It should be used strategically. The economic times call for it. If we embark upon quantitative easing, and this is the debate we're having now, when the economy is doing well, and we have quantitative easing measures in place, it can do things like create asset bubbles or exacerbate costs on certain things. If you keep interest rates low, artificially low, and you encourage people not to save, but to invest, you're putting upward pressure on assets. For people, it would be households. For companies, it could be property, plant, equipment, things. Asset prices go up, and that has itself a series of externalities, which can be both positive for people who already own real estate and negative for people who are looking to buy real estate, and a bunch of other very complex interactions. And so when you look at tapering, view that as a return to normal a normal economic state, which is non-recessionary and non-recovery. And so this would be like, in an average year, 3% GDP growth, we're doing okay. We don't need to incentivize the economy in any way. In the same way that we don't want to overjuice, or we don't want to become addicted to certain quantitative elements. And maybe that's an improper term. Maybe it's something that's, we don't want to be too accustomed to excessive amounts of quantitative easing, because what that can do is it makes, ultimately, other things can cause a recession. And if we use all of our policy tools at one time, that limits our ability to embark upon additional policy tools in the future. Now, somebody could counter that argument, and they could say, well, we've proven that, in last year, we issued about $5 trillion of stimulus. The government can issue more money. That can be a direct stimulus payment that can jumpstart the economy. Maybe it's separate and above the question of Federal Reserve. And all of these things are quantitative easing elements, but they don't add to a recession. They're a sign, and the easing of it is a signal that we're approaching, or the Fed is comfortable with our current economic situation.
Okay, so to recap, quantitative easing is used to ease things out and stimulate people to spend money, but
Right.
this will result in asset bubbles and things going up. And when you taper it away,
Right.
the everything is trying to go back to normal. We're currently seeing very high asset stock market and housing prices. And if
Yes.
the Fed is
Yes.
announcing quantitative tapering or whatever it's called, um, does that mean something's
Hmm.
about to pop?
That's a very good question. And so the theory, a consensus viewpoint would say, not if it's done slowly and carefully. And so they don't turn off the spigots immediately. They
Mhm.
first signal that they're thinking about turning off the spigots. Then they like shut off one spigot a little bit. and they kind of do it. It's like watching my 7-year-old son, like play with the water.
Mhm.
He's that kind of thing. He's like, I'm like, just finish the bath. And he's like, just no. It's like one of those things. He'll just turn it like 10 degrees to the right. And
Mhm.
and the hard part is that's designed intentionally to get the market accustomed to these realities. If the Fed were to raise rates very quickly, one error that was considered a monetary policy error, but it was we were very afraid. So traditionally, the Federal Reserve has two mandates. It's called the dual mandate. One is to keep inflation at around 2% or less, and the other is for full employment. And in 2005, 2006, 2007, as we led up into the 2008 financial crisis, we raised rates very quickly. We had very low rates, and then we raised them very rapidly, over 3%, 4% in a year. That's a very, very high level of rate because people were very afraid of inflation.
Mhm.
And now the idea is when we talk about the Fed quantitative easing, it's not 3% over a year, it's 0.25% every 6 months or something of that level, which, if done in a moderate way, should let the air out of the balloon lightly. But it does mean that air will have to come out of the balloon, and it will. Raising rates will, through its effect in other rates of the economy, also, and particularly how the 10-year bond affects mortgage rates, raising rates will encourage growth to slow on these markets. And that's the strategy currently. Can we do it without causing distress?
Okay, quite an interesting topic.
Do you think it's up to you, Colin? How do you think, Colin? Do you think we can do it? That's the question. So that's the theory. So you're going to see the talk is going to be in 2022. How do we raise rates slowly? We need to look out for inflation. We need to reduce this without without putting a cap on our economic growth or recovery.
Is there a potential problem if it's raised too slowly?
Oh, yes. So the big issue, the only reason you would raise rates, and that's a good question. So nothing will keep us from keeping rates near zero. We did that for years before this situation. And that makes, in the last 13 years, and this is very interesting, have been very odd in monetary policy because we dropped rates in response to the 2008 recession. We only raised them briefly about 3 or 4 years back and then not even that much. And then, so this year it comes down to the question of, and this is the waiting game. If inflation remains temporary, or the impression of it that it remains temporary, the Fed can get away with very slow or even non-existent rates increasing. This jobs report is interesting because the jobs report, the market response on it was first it didn't know what to make of it, and then the market has kind of ended the day in being like, this jobs report was okay because we had participation coming back. The Fed needs good news to embark upon a rate increase. This might be enough of good news to say we can increase rates a little bit and perhaps curb inflation. Albert asks, what are the chances of stagflation? When you think of stagflation, you think of sort of the 1970s, where you have both inflation and no economic growth. Right now, we have very good economic growth. I mean, this year, we're going to end up with 5.5% GDP growth this year, expected to be 4% next year still, which is, again, good. That is a good rate. I know you're doing your head thinking, well, Reilly, in real terms, it's actually, if we think about if we incorporate inflation in these numbers, and you'd be absolutely right to be hesitant, but growth is still strong. In stagflationary economies, you don't see ports clogged with goods. You don't see robust retail surveys. You don't see data like we have from the Franklin Institute, which I'll show you here. This tracks the recession risk. And to sort of answer this, to get stagflation, we would have to raise interest rates, and then have persistent inflation, and interest rates that rose significantly and were unable to keep up with inflation, would produce a stagflationary scenario. Right now, if we look at our November 30th data across the board, and to give you a sense of this, I didn't put the key down here. Green is a good signal. Orange is the circle is a bad signal, and there actually is a red. The red going down means it's a bad signal. Green means expansion of the economy. Red means low. There's no red on this map. No matter how we look at financial, consumer, business activity, the economy is growing quite strongly. And I think that's a very, very interesting sense of this. So right now, I don't see any risk of it, but like right now we have growth and inflation. If we have an absence of both things or we have both things, but hopefully we can maintain growth and lower inflation somewhat. And that would produce perhaps a more optimal outcome for many consumers. That's a really good question. You guys are asking, this is great. Good questions. Albert, as an audience member, is very good. Colin, your questions are great. Anyways, all right. So this is good. So unemployment's falling faster than previous recessions. We look at the Great Recession. This is what's so interesting about this. It took years to get out of this, And then what we had in the COVID-19 crisis, we had this big expansion followed by us going back to normal in a much quicker trajectory. Now, one thing that we're looking at is what is the source of our sort of drop in labor force participation? And this is what's really, really interesting from an analysis standpoint. And so if we think about these things, elevated unemployment is usually what takes up the biggest chunk of the pie when you're in the middle of a recession. And then as the recession ends, higher unemployment, people tend to get jobs, long-term unemployed tend to get jobs. Aging is very interesting. This aging drag, boomers aging out of the market, that aging drag unemployment is likely to continue. They polled economists this month and asked them, so we're still, we're down. Before this jobs report, we had about 4 million fewer people working in the workforce. Are the people that are not working, is it due to one, actually, let me put it this way. The economists were asked, is this permanent or not permanent? And 40% of economists thought these job losses would be basically permanent. The participation rate peaked actually in the year 2000 at about 67%. And now it's gone down, of course, to this level that's much lower. And so it's likely that continued aging will affect this. But at that same time, we think about aging, we also know that we have a stack of data that shows people are very unprepared for their retirement incomes. We're going to have perhaps older Americans in particular looking for second careers in various capacities, perhaps coming back on the workforce at some point in the future to supplement their income. And so I think we'll see more of that. So I don't think this aging is going to make us fall off a cliff. I think it will be a significant drag on our participation rate. But and that's the interesting part about this. Now, we look at something like this. So growth slowed in November, 210,000. And we've had this has been the jobs report this year. We had, remember the June and July jobs reports, those the golden era of Albert's list. And we were getting 1 million jobs a month, all from Albert's list members. But going back to January 2021, this is the most disappointing job report we've seen this year by pure numbers. But at the same time, we expect these numbers to gradually slow down as we get more hirings. And the revisions that happened in the last two jobs reports were upward, which means that we actually did better than we thought we did. And one thing that, as we approach this, I'm going to add I'm going to keep dropping some interesting stuff in here. One thing that's interesting, I looked at a holiday season retail hiring. This is like, how robust is our holiday season hiring, particularly in retail? And this is a very interesting sector. So retail, of course, numbers were not good in the last jobs report. If we look at October, November, we don't have December numbers yet. We are keeping up aggressively to where we were almost in the previous years, even though we're down from last year, and that is substantial. I think there was an anticipation that there was still stimulus money in the retail sector that could be spent. I think, frankly, the combination of lower average retail wages followed by a very mixed bag when it comes to expenditures. The economic recovery is uneven. If we look at household surveys, looking at how people are expected to spend money in the holidays, people at the top tier income level are expected to increase their expenses this year by 15% during the holiday season. That's a huge number. People in the bottom tier of the income level are actually going to cut back by 22%. And the number of people who plan on spending $0 during the holiday season doubled from about 5% to 10% of the population. And that's very good. And that's as somebody who's inherently very, very cheap. I'm like, that sounds, I'm like, you're all heroes. But one thing is on this, no, I'm just kidding. You always support your loved ones. But one thing on this is that the numbers were very robust, relatively speaking, in October. They're okay. They're also still pretty good in November. I think we'll cap it off with around 100K extra in December, but we'll be below last year. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Will it be affected by the recent report that our recent Black Friday sales were extremely low?
Oh, yes. That was really interesting. So I looked at this, Colin. Yeah. I was not surprised by that. And the reason was, and this is very interesting, is that consumer behavior, like we had, if we're drawing a trajectory line, as many people all have finance departments looking at lines. They drew 2019, 2020 levels were way above where they were in 2019. They drew that line upward in 2021 and said, people are more confident they're going to spend money on the holidays. I actually don't believe that. I think right now we were flooded with 5 trillion again. And many of that, not all that 5 trillion was stimulus money. We had a proportion of that went directly to individuals. Those stimulus checks powered the holiday season last year. Those no longer exist. So we're dropping off the face in many cases. So what they planned on seeing for Black Friday would not. And I don't know. I'm waiting for. I don't know. Is any Cyber Monday data out yet too that you saw? I only saw the Black Friday stuff, Colin.
Let me take a quick look.
Oh gosh. And this is good, Scott. That's a great question. I'm so glad you brought up PPP loans. I was just talking about them. So PPP loans availability and their applicability, preserving pre-pandemic job numbers. Can we expect increased job losses in reactions to unexpected economic events? So this is a good question. So one of the programs in that I think it's heralded, and it's actually interesting. I think people have many thoughts about PPP and its relationship. Some research came out and suggested that PPP loans themselves, perhaps if we didn't have embarked upon a PPP program. And those of you who didn't know what they were, what this was is this allowed businesses to get these loans from the government, and they didn't have to pay them back if they used them for a series of approved expenses that were designed to keep people on payrolls. And so what happened was we ended up in a situation where a lot of businesses got these. There was some some critics of this policy worried that it would be taken advantage of by people larger companies who were in the know, and they just were more able at sort of playing the system, and they had dedicated financial and accounting departments. That did happen. We did find, though, there's a recent paper in the Review of Finance that just came out, I think in the last month. It was really interesting that addressed PPP loans, and they found that 15% or so of companies, through force of guilt and will, gave back the money from the PPP program. They were typically larger companies, and they were basically shamed into not taking out PPP loans. They surveyed a bunch of companies. It was a fascinating relationship, and it did positively affect many small businesses. And I think that our recovery is based upon that. I would actually argue, Scott, that I think that this program in some ways should continue with any future recession that we have. And I know it might be in some ways, it is, but it depends on the nature of the recession. The PPP loan was effective because we had immediate drop in economic activity that could be easily remedied. Some recessions don't come about that way, and it's not easy to see how that happens. So I think that it would be harder to embark upon a PPP policy in a traditional recession. I think that over-reliance on any one single economic activity, I think we have to continue to be novel and innovate the way that we expand and look at, how we respond to economic downturns. And I think that our business is more or less susceptible to an economic downturn. That's tough to say. Assuming that most businesses on the expiration of those loans did indeed, they don't need to pay them back because they use them for payroll or other expenses, then I think we will be okay. If, on the other hand, we expect some job losses and some of these companies to have spent it for other reasons, which I'm certain that happened, I think you'll see some vulnerability there, especially any company that increases its debt load. Debt is a source of aggregate volatility when it comes down to the recession, and particularly when you look at other things related to it. So I love that. I love that question. So Albert says, I don't think we're even done doling out the money yet. I feel like we haven't even begun to figure out rent moratoriums. That's a really good question. Rent moratoriums are really interesting policy initiatives. And so over the short run, they can be effective policy. Over the long run, they're not considered good economic policy because rent control has an effect of disincentivizing landlords from reinvesting in properties. Consequently, properties can fall out of shape. They produce these sort of burned out and derelict districts and other things. It's a very volatile and interesting scenario, but at the same time, we have and so how can we support people to pay for rent in a reasonable way? And then there's the broader question of, well, actually, rent prices are indeed, like other parts of the economy, affected by supply and demand. And so if we made a lot of new apartments and housing buildings, and I'm always a big contrarian zoning guy, so no matter how much you like single family homes in Silicon Valley, if I had my way, I would build more multifamily and multi-story structures and then have them follow. But that, of course, in terms of relative NIMBYism, is a very contentious view. How will you think excess rent will factor to the economy? With all money being printed to cover rent, will there be any concern there? I do actually think that rent is a particular concern. What makes this interesting is when you think about CPI, we think about a representative basket of goods that follows the price index. So as things go up in price, people are really affected by energy, gas costs, people are really affected by rent. And it's a very important number to consider. I would actually embark upon, so short-term solutions work, long-term solutions, I would consider, how do you look at zoning policy? How do you look at multifamily policy? And how do you look at potentially expanding the supply of units so that a more competitive environment can actually produce housing which reasonable people can afford? Scott says PPP loans rewarded solid and well-operating business models through turbulent times. I agree, Scott. I'm not disagreeing. I love PPP loans, and they were very effective. In the state of New Mexico, they had about $3.2 billion that were taken out in PPP loans, and they estimate, the University of Chicago in a paper estimated that PPP loans saved basically 18 million jobs from being there, and we'd be in even worse shape. So Scott, I'm in agreement with you. I'm just asking myself is, do I think it'll be more vulnerable or not? I think we should always embark upon PPP loans, but I think the problem is this, it was a particularly good policy choice because of the nature of this particular recession. I don't think it would be the same if it was a gradual decline. I don't think it'd be the same. We have a bunch of, it's a fascinating environment, but I think it's good business policy. I think it's very strong.
Vikram also asked a question.
Yeah.
How is part-time contract composition shifting in this data for non-seasonal?
Oh yes, Vikram, I'm so sorry for I'm so sorry for I saw your message and then I didn't intentionally I show you. I got so excited about PPP loans. Who isn't excited about PPP loans? I'm of all the things to come out of this recession, PPP loans were like my favorite policy position. So this is interesting. Part-time contract composition in data. One of the things that we were just talking about this in a panel on Wednesday, and we're looking at this, and somebody brought up the question, what about part-time work? What about gig work? What about sort of the gig economy type jobs? The hard part is we don't have good data on that information. We send out a survey on this, and the thing is, people say they're employed, unemployed, and these things, and we don't get a sense about this contract composition in that sense. And so I always argue that regarding gig economy type data, we don't have the level of resolution as we do in other places. And so when we think about people and their full-time hustle or their full-time side hustle or their part-time side hustle or their hustle, we end up in a situation where we actually don't, it is very, very hard to track, and the data that I have on it is stale. So if we think about this, let me grab one piece of data that I know. We have a career outlook, and the BLS comes out with these wonderful little, like, here's what it's going to happen. The gig workforce will be 36% bigger by, some year. Everything is generalized. So one thing that we can look at, and let me summon my old, I'm trying to find an old graphic I used in another presentation here, but perhaps, and let's see if we can express it in a different way, because that's such a good question. So the closest thing to represent what you're representing would be perhaps looking at the people who are employed part-time for economic reasons. And in this sense, we have about 4.3 million people in our economy that are part-time for economic reasons. And this was basically unchanged from the previous month. So to answer your question, Vikram, we have not been addressing people who are in this category. But I also question, I don't believe that's comprehensive enough in its value in the way that the survey questions ask that data to include people who are in a gig economy, but may not perceive themselves as such. So the short answer is it's consistent. People want to, there's still 4 million people who want to work more than they are. And this number didn't really change. And the fun part about this is, and this is the weird part, right? So if we go back in time, and this goes back to a table, I think A8 in BLS, they have a sort of how the part-time for economic reasons have changed over time. In the beginning of 2020, we had still about 4 million people who were part-time for economic reasons. So almost throughout this whole period, we're back to where we were before, but we're all part-time. But it's been amazingly, although it did jump a bit, it did change a bit in let me see if I can find that table. In the beginning of 2020, we're back to kind of where we were before. And let's see, part-time, yeah, there it is. It is A8. Non-economic reasons, part-time for economic reasons. We were at not seasonally adjusted, November 2020. So we reached a high level during the pandemic in November. So for instance, in 2020, it shot up to 6.5 million, and then now it's back down to 4, but it's been 4 for a while. So it's there, but it's not doing well. And the amount of gig work particularly is we struggle with the lack of data to interpret the economy. That's always the interesting part, right? Anything, we talk about black markets in economic and financial research as being outside of the light of day. We always have these very nefarious terms for things. Like if you want to buy stock or trade stock with a company outside of an index, outside of like NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, you can do so. You can have a private agreement that's called a dark pool. So we have all these, like, it sounds like an ominous, everything is ominous sounding. And so hourly earnings, I want to point this out as well. When there's a labor shortage in a particular sector, to get workers, I mean, there is a fair price, again, at which everybody will do a certain job. And I mean this, of course, within the bounds of your sense of ethics. But I mean, like, there's a sense of like there is a job where I would work as, I would be like professors and deanship. I'm an assistant dean. I'd blow it off for like a dishwasher if they paid me enough money, right? And it's like this sort of thing. There is a price for many types of work that we would do. Whether that gets, whether that trade-off makes sense based on our education, that's up in the air. But average hourly earnings in leisure and hospitality has jumped year on year, 13.4%. 13.4% increase in wages. That's the orange line. And this is 2020, this is where it is. And this shows you, this is the highest year-on-year increases we've seen since the 1960s. And even then we exceeded those numbers. And those existed because we had terribly high inflation at the same time. And average hourly earnings increased about 6% in this metric as well. These are very, very high numbers across the economy. And then we just have 2 more things left. First thing is things to think about as well. I like to follow this because this is interesting. This is less exciting, and this is what we talk about when there isn't a recession. We talk about how is our current account surplus doing? So our current account, one of the things we look at is, are we importing or exporting more than we produce? And so, or are we spending more than we produce? And these are interesting questions. So our current account, when you think about surplus in money and services and goods and secondary income, we've been running a deficit for quite a long time, and this deficit has been deepening. In the long run, stuff like this has the effect of reducing the value of our currency relative to other places. Yet, it doesn't, and it's been going up in value because relative to other places are doing things that the economy likes worse. And to kind of cap this off, and I know we're at 707 already, the Shiller PE ratio. One of the ways we look at, are assets overvalued, are prices overvalued? And I'm not speaking to this point to you as a financial advisor looking at these things, Many of you own stock. Many of you work for companies that have provided you with stocks and equities. Many of you have bought it on your own or trade on your own. And you're looking at the markets going right now and saying, well, markets are still really expensive. And it's very uneven. There are some deals that can be had out there, but there's a lot of big companies that are driving a lot of our growth. One of the ways that we track whether a market is overvalued or undervalued is something using the price. Whether we track whether a market is overvalued or undervalued is using something called the price to earnings ratio, which is called the PE ratio. What this does is it takes the price of stock and divides it by the earnings per share, how much profit the company makes divided by the number of shareholders. And the idea being is over the long run, we expect a certain ratio to happen. Like usually, based on certain numbers, we expect in the long run, this number is usually close to 20 or 25, meaning that the price of a stock is 20 or 25 times more than earnings per share. This is heavily affected by macroeconomic conditions. So for instance, in the early 1980s, interest rates were really, really high. So that meant that if interest rates are high, people would prefer to buy bonds, which are less risky, than put their money in stocks, which are more risky. And the market was at this sort of nadir. We had profitable companies, but the PE ratio across the market was really, really low. It was super undervalued. And then we had like 1929, that was Black Tuesday. The stock market shot up in value, and then it dropped in 1929 in October 29. And then that led, of course, to the economic Great Recession and all of our economic data that came out of that. And then, of course, 2000, we had the tech bubble, near and dear to everyone's heart, back when everyone knew the internet was going to be something, but we couldn't decide which companies were going to do well. Is it going to be Amazon, or is it going to be pets.com, or is it going to be something else? I don't know. I know that it says internet in it. Let me throw money at this. We had tons of money flowing in, very little profits, and that caused a lot of what became known as irrational exuberance. And then, of course, right now, in 2021, as of today, our price to earnings ratio in the Shiller PE ratio metric across the largest firms in the economy is at 38. This is very close to this, basically the second highest period, apart from the tech bubble, that we've ever seen. But the tech bubble occurred at a time when rates weren't 0%. And rates right now are very close to zero, which means that when there's no place to put your money to earn a return, people will take on additional risk to earn additional return. And the stock market is a place to do that. And so consequently, it is pricey, but there's nothing ipso facto that says it will go down tomorrow. What will affect this calculus is if the Federal Reserve raise rates come up, increase across the system. People will then shift assets from places that they might consider too risky, like the market, and put it into things like bonds and other things. These are things to watch out for 2022, 2023. So I thought that was a nice uplifting an ominous way to end this presentation. All right, guys, questions you have? No such thing as a silly one, and I'll do my best to answer.
Following up on the earlier question, which was Cyber Monday deals. Apparently, Cyber Monday had a 1% drop in sales.
Ah, good find. 1%.
1% less.
Yeah. And this is interesting. I wonder what the 2-year rate was. I think, and this is, we have like, we always have, among academics, we always have these informal, like locker room, fisticuffs about economic data. And we were talking about this the other day, and I don't know, I was negative, and I still don't believe marketing surveys and holiday spending. And I told one of our local news outlets this, and I'm like, this is, everyone's consensus estimates are an 8% increase across the board. I'm going to be really surprised if we hit those numbers. I think that's not a rational thing, but I don't think we should be worried about it. I think we're underestimating how big of an effect the stimulus was last year on holiday spending, but that's what we wanted it to happen. We wanted people to spend money so they would go and people would continue to have jobs, and raises and wages would go up. And now, in the absence of direct stimulus checks and other things, and knowing that people, and actually I'll show you why I thought this way. So Fred, the Federal Reserve Economic Database keeps track of something called the personal savings rate. And the personal savings rate over time shows us, what percentage of our income that, as predictably, we save. And it also kind of gives a sense for how much, excess money we have floating around the system. How many things that we have that might not work. So I'm grabbing this chart for you from the Federal Reserve Economic Data Set, and I'll paste it. I'll make a new slide here. We'll do a little street finance here, put it on here. So here's what we got. And so in this one, so this tracks it from 2012 on the left to today. The savings rate has always been basically around 5 to 8% since 2012. Oh, wait, during the pandemic, the savings rate shot up. People lost jobs, but we also injected a lot of money into the economy. Savings rate remained elevated right through this during the holiday period where people spent money last year and then in the start of this year. But right now, the savings rate is back to right smack dab where we were before the pandemic. And that suggests to me that we should expect normal rather than super normal or abnormally high holiday spending in the future. So I'd be concerned if this savings rate dropped precipitously, but I suspect it will stay fairly close to the 6 or 7% marker over the next 6 months. That's a good, yeah. So that's why I think, that's why I'm not surprised.
Okay.
So Albert asks, what should be, Reilly, we're here for worries. Our anxieties are not significant enough on this job search board. Can you provide me a sense of worries? I would be interested. I would actually follow. I think the market is very expensive. I think how the market responds to rate hikes in the next year will be very interesting. I would keep an eye on inflation. Inflation is still perceived to be transitory. We talked about that last time. But the downside is that anything could throw a wrench into this. Used cars as a good example of this. Shot up hugely in August, September, and October numbers. We had a little bit of improvement. Again, in November, they're back up to where we were back in summer. They're incredibly expensive to buy a used car. One of the worst things to be in is if you end up in an accident or anything else, or God forbid, anything else bad happens to anyone, and you have to buy a car in a short amount of time. It is so hard to find inventory and fair prices at this particular juncture. So I think supply chain issues that last for more than a year keep me up at night, Albert.
So two quick questions.
Mhm.
Earlier, the holiday season retail hiring. I'm curious why that chart has negatives.
Oh.
Does that mean people got fired?
Yes.
Like, I'm really
curious. That's
curious.
right. Oh, this is a great question. So this is great. That's a great question. Go back to 1980, 81, 82. We had a recession in 1980 and a recession in 1982. And then at the beginning of 1989, right as we entered the beginning of 1990. And so what we saw during these holiday seasons were unique macroeconomic circumstances that produced negative values for those months. But still in aggregate, even though October numbers were bad, November, December numbers ended up on top, even in those terrible times. Oh, Joanna, it's good to see you again, Joanna. Hope your month has been well. In your mind, what will happen to those Chinese companies currently traded in the US stock market? What's the chance they will be delisted? Oh my gosh, that is a great question.
Wait,
I struggle with that
companies?
because our portfolio question, so we, I'll put, so, well, as part of our, the university where I work, as in part of my directorship of this portfolio program, as Albert pointed out, Albert, as Albert and Colin have pointed out in the past, we had about $3.6 million. We have over $5 million in that account now because of just the appreciation of the markets in recent times. One bet, though, that has haunted me is that my students, being smart, robust, and actively interested in markets, noticed that we invested into quite a few of our international companies were Chinese companies. Of course, given the political situation in China and sort of the crackdown in large companies and businesses that we've seen, and we've seen a lot of firms reach historic lows, like Alibaba just this week, of course, famously hit sort of this new low. So the downside is this is a really interesting play because I'm betting outside of my comfort zone on a political rather than a necessarily economic situation. Now, as long as, and this is the interesting part, do I think they'll be delisted? There are so many active investors in the United States who are invested in this. And I want to give you a sense of this, and I'll show you. And so when a company from any other country wants to raise money in the United States, they form what's called an ADR, which means American Depository Receipt. And this is, so this is like if I'm, if Toyota in Japan, when they came to the United States and issued and wanted to raise money in the United States, they made an ADR and they issued equity. And if you looked at the price of Toyota at that time, in the United States market and the price in Japan, you could divide by the currency exchange rate and get approximately the same value in both places because the stock can be traded on multiple exchanges and it should be traded fairly. And I know there's like my finance pros who are like, well, you know, we can arbitrage it. We can, you know, yeah. But Joanna, to your very, very good question, right now, 2 years ago, I would have said the risk of that was very low. Now I think the risk of that is moderate, but, and I want to point out, and let me bring it up on, and I want to kind of bring up an important thing. If we look at the amount of money that is currently invested in the Alibaba ADR, even at, which is traded on the New York Stock Exchange, they still have a market cap of about $321 billion. And so, and I think the Chinese government knows this as well. It would be an interesting and fascinating policy move for them to delist them. It wouldn't remove their ADR status. Now, to answer your question, because you're really looking at the question of delisting, and when we think of the two big exchanges where we trade stocks in the United States, one is the New York Stock Exchange, where everybody throws paper tickers around. There's bookmakers, and it's like this thing. And then there's like a NASDAQ, which is just the silent and not silent, but the continuous humming of machines making calculations like every other market in the world. Different exchanges maintain listing rules, and to abide, any company who wishes to be part of the any company who wishes to be part of the index has to abide by these listing rules. And some of them are like benign. They're like, oh, we need you to trade at more than $1 per share for more than 30 days. And then if a company falls off that level, they're traded over the counter, or OTC. And this is also known as the pink sheets. It will affect the long-term valuation of Alibaba in that case as a stock, but it won't make them worthless. Many large companies exist off of the exchanges. And actually, what's the largest? That's a really good trivia question for your next, trivia night. Tencent is the largest over-the-counter. Another company who's been suffering. Tencent is the largest over-the-counter stock in the United States right now. The market cap for Tencent is $500 billion. People are not shying away from trading Tencent, and they wouldn't shy away from trading Alibaba either. And so if Alibaba is delisted, it probably won't affect them that much. And I think people will still invest it as a portfolio stake. But then to your other question, what's going to happen? It shouldn't be something that is, well, long-term bullish on the Chinese economy, short-term bearish on political interference with economic, with firms. so it makes me very nervous. We're still holding in our portfolio. The students didn't want to look at it this year. They were too scared. I'm like, no, but it's so interesting. I need to form opinions about this. And so we're still holding right now. And so we'll see what happens. We own Baba and Tencent. So, it's been an unpleasant ride. So I don't think, so the good news is they can delist. They'll still be here. We're not gonna, and people I think will still buy them. Other questions? Anyone else have anything? And thank you for letting me go longer. I'm sorry. I'm always so grateful. I get too lazy to stop talking.
So much to talk about, so much to think about, so much to consider. Are there any other questions for Dr. White while he's still here? And wow, I learned so much. Thank you for going through the jobs report, inflation,
oh gosh,
unemployment rates, the big picture.
Thank you for not falling asleep.
No, it's just fascinating. I feel like a very good understanding of the economic now will give us a better preparation for the economic future. It does not seem like anybody is willing to post any more questions. Maybe they're shy, but maybe there's always next time. So I guess we will do our outro. Thank you, Dr. Reilly, and thank you to all our audience members for attending tonight's webinar. We hope that with this information, you feel better to chat someone up or hit 2022 in stride. We have numerous other events upcoming that you might be interested in. There is a link I dropped in the chat below. Please click on it, maybe learn if you would like to come to any of our other webinars. And in the meantime, have a wonderful night and happy holidays.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming.
I will stop recording now.